For years, Windows was my digital home. Every laptop I bought came with it, every desktop I built revolved around it, and every workflow I developed depended on it. I knew where every setting lived, how to fix driver issues, how to deal with updates, and how to optimize performance when things slowed down. Like millions of people, I accepted Windows as the default operating system without really questioning whether there was a better alternative. Linux always seemed interesting from a distance, but also intimidating. I imagined black terminal windows, confusing commands, compatibility problems, and endless troubleshooting. It felt like an operating system only programmers or hardcore tech enthusiasts could survive with. But eventually curiosity won. I decided to do something I honestly thought I would regret. I completely removed Windows from my main PC and replaced it with Linux for 30 days. No dual boot safety net, no quick switching back, no cheating. Just Linux as my only operating system for an entire month. I expected frustration, limitations, and maybe a few moments of regret. What I didn't expect was how much this experience would completely change the way I think about computers. The first surprise came before I even installed Linux. Choosing a Linux distribution felt overwhelming because there are so many options. Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, Arch Linux, Pop_OS, Debian, and countless others. Each community claimed their version was the best. After researching for hours, I decided to go with Linux Mint because people kept describing it as beginner-friendly and comfortable for former Windows users. I downloaded the ISO, flashed it onto a USB drive, rebooted my PC, and prepared for disaster. Instead, the installation process shocked me with how simple it was. Within about 20 minutes, Linux Mint was installed, updated, and ready to use. No forced Microsoft account, no endless setup questions. No advertisements. No pre-installed games or bloatware. Just a clean desktop waiting for me. The first boot into Linux felt strange. Everything looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The desktop environment resembled Windows enough that I wasn't lost, but it also felt cleaner and lighter. The system booted faster than Windows ever had on the same SSD. Applications opened instantly. Even basic animations felt smoother. I kept waiting for the moment where everything would break, but it never came. Instead, I found myself exploring. The software manager gave me access to thousands of applications with one click. Installing software felt safer and easier than hunting random exe files online. Updates were centralized instead of scattered across different launchers and installers. It felt oddly organized. Then reality hit. I started trying to use Linux for real work, and that's where the challenge began. My workflow on Windows depended heavily on certain applications. Adobe Photoshop, Microsoft Office, specific utilities, gaming launchers, and proprietary tools I had used for years. Some simply didn't exist on Linux. Others had alternatives that looked questionable at first glance. This was the moment I almost gave up. The comfort of Windows suddenly seemed very appealing again. But instead of quitting, I forced myself to adapt. I replaced Microsoft Office with LibreOffice. I swapped Photoshop for GIMP and Krita. I began using Firefox more heavily. I explored open-source alternatives for everyday apps. At first it felt inconvenient, like moving into a new house where you don't know where anything is. But after a few days, something surprising happened. I stopped missing most Windows applications. In fact, many Linux alternatives were faster and less bloated. LibreOffice opened instantly compared to Microsoft Office. GIMP handled most of my editing needs surprisingly well. The entire operating system felt focused instead of cluttered. One of the biggest shocks during the experiment was performance. My PC genuinely felt newer under Linux. RAM usage was dramatically lower. CPU temperatures stayed cooler. Background activity was minimal. On Windows, I had grown used to random spikes in disk usage, mystery processes eating resources, and fans spinning loudly for no obvious reason. Linux felt calm, efficient, respectful of my hardware. Even my aging laptop suddenly became usable again. Boot times dropped dramatically, and battery life improved more than I expected. It honestly felt like Linux gave older hardware a second life. Gaming was the area I expected to fail completely, but this turned out to be one of the most shocking discoveries of the entire experiment. Linux gaming in 2026 is nothing like the horror stories people still repeat online. Steam's Proton compatibility layer has changed everything. I installed Steam, enabled Proton, and started testing games. One after another, they launched successfully. Some even performed better than they did on Windows. Titles I assumed would never run worked almost flawlessly. Of course, not everything was perfect. Certain multiplayer games with aggressive anti-cheat systems still caused issues, and some launchers behaved unpredictably. But overall, Linux gaming was far beyond what I imagined possible. The idea that Linux is terrible for gaming feels increasingly outdated. Another thing that surprised me was how much control Linux gives the user. Windows increasingly feels like an operating system designed around Microsoft's priorities instead of the user's priorities. Ads in the start menu, forced updates, telemetry, cloud integration pushed everywhere, AI features nobody asked for, and settings constantly changing between versions. Linux felt different. It felt like my computer actually belonged to me again. I could customize nearly everything. I could choose how updates worked. I could remove components I didn't need. Nothing was forcing itself onto my machine. That freedom became addictive very quickly. Then there was the terminal. The thing I feared most ended up becoming one of my favorite parts of Linux. At first, I avoided it completely. But eventually, tutorials and troubleshooting guides introduced me to basic commands. Slowly, the terminal stopped feeling scary and started feeling powerful. Installing applications through a single command felt efficient. Updating the entire system in seconds felt futuristic. Automating tasks became possible in ways Windows never made easy. The terminal wasn't replacing the graphical interface, it was enhancing it. Once I became comfortable with it, I understood why Linux users love it so much. That doesn't mean the 30 days were perfect. Linux absolutely still has weaknesses. Hardware compatibility can occasionally be frustrating, especially with certain printers, Wi-Fi adapters, or specialized devices. Some commercial software simply doesn't exist natively. Troubleshooting can sometimes require searching forums and reading technical discussions that beginners may find confusing. There were moments where I spent an hour fixing something that would have worked automatically on Windows. Linux also demands a willingness to learn. If you expect everything to function exactly like Windows, you'll probably hate the experience. But here's what truly shocked me. The frustrations never outweighed the benefits. Every small inconvenience came with a sense of ownership and understanding that Windows rarely provides. Instead of fighting against my operating system, I felt like I was working with it. The Linux community also surprised me. Forums, Reddit threads, YouTube tutorials, and Discord communities were filled with people genuinely eager to help beginners. Unlike the stereotype of elitist Linux users mocking newcomers, I found many people excited to guide others through the transition. Around the third week, something unexpected happened. I stopped thinking about Linux entirely. It just became my computer. My daily workflow normalized. Browsing, editing, gaming, writing, streaming, multitasking, and general productivity all felt natural. That was the moment I realized the experiment had fundamentally changed my perspective. Linux wasn't some experimental hobby operating system anymore. It was genuinely practical for everyday use. Then I made the mistake of using a Windows PC again. Suddenly everything felt heavier, slower, cluttered. Notifications appeared constantly. Background processes consumed resources. Updates interrupted workflows. Ads and suggestions appeared in places they shouldn't. Features I never asked for demanded attention. I realized I had spent years tolerating things that Linux simply didn't force on me. Going back to Windows after adapting to Linux felt strangely uncomfortable. By the end of the 30 days, the biggest shock wasn't that Linux worked. The biggest shock was realizing how many myths about Linux are outdated. Most people still imagine Linux as a complicated operating system only suitable for developers and hackers. But modern Linux distributions are far more accessible than many realize. The desktop experience has matured dramatically. Gaming support has improved enormously. Software availability is better than ever. For many users, especially those tired of Windows direction, Linux has become a realistic alternative. Would I recommend Linux to everyone? Not necessarily. If your job depends on highly specific Windows-only software, switching may be difficult. If you want absolute simplicity with zero learning curve, Windows or Mac OS may still suit you better. But if you value privacy, performance, customization, control, and efficiency, Linux deserves serious consideration. The learning curve exists, but it's nowhere near as terrifying as people think. When I started this challenge, I expected Linux to feel like a compromise. I thought I'd spend 30 days enduring limitations just to satisfy curiosity before crawling back to Windows. Instead, I discovered an operating system that felt faster, cleaner, more respectful, and surprisingly enjoyable. Linux didn't just replace Windows for me temporarily. It completely changed my expectations for what a personal computer should feel like. After 30 days, I faced the question I never expected to ask myself. Would I reinstall Windows? To my own surprise, the answer was no. Linux had already become home.